So you're buying a commercial real estate property. Now what? In this video, I'll be discussing the process that I use to get you from contract to closing. Let's get comfy. All right, the contract's signed, and now the next step is to get that contract circulated between the different parties that are involved in the transaction. So once that's circulated, the next step is the earnest money. And so we want to make sure we know who is holding that earnest money. Now, it may be one of the agencies that are involved, the seller's agency or the buyer's agency. It may be the seller's attorney, or it may be the title company. If you are using the title company, make sure that you're checking to see, is there any fees charged for them to hold the earnest money that would have to get paid if the transaction doesn't close? And so sometimes having that conversation up front is going to be beneficial, because then you can have a conversation between the parties of, okay, who's responsible for those fees if this transaction doesn't move forward. The next step after earnest money is deposited is your inspection, attorney review, or generally speaking, your due diligence process. And so one of the first things you should be doing is having an inspection done. Now, for this example, I'm assuming that you're buying a property that has a commercial building on it. You may be occupying that space for your own use. It may be an investment property where there's tenants in it and you're not occupying the space, or it might be a mixture of the two. So part of the inspection process is going to be bringing in a third-party inspector who can give you a general overview of the property. So they're going to look at things on the structure, the roof, the mechanical systems, and so on. You may also want to bring in more specialist type of inspectors for things like pests, as well as if there's a septic system or a well on the site. And if you're doing any type of improvements to the property, now is the time to bring in your contractors. Ideally, try to schedule a day and a time with the seller so that, hey, we're going to bring through 3, 4, 5 different contractors to look at the roof, the plumbing, the electric, whatever it may be. Ideally, you try to batch all those at one time if you can, but definitely during your due diligence process, this is the time when you want to make sure that you're doing those things. Speaking of financing, you'll want to make sure that you're getting your financing process started. The sooner, the better. So making sure that you're getting all your documentation sent into the lender. That might be tax returns, that might be personal financial statements, and anything else that the lender needs in order to do their underwriting on that property. More than likely, the lender is going to need a copy of the contract, and make sure that you're looping them into that in the early stages, because you really want to make sure that they are starting their process on their end, as the lending process could take 30, 45 days or longer, depending on the type of loan that you're using. All right, so after inspections, I'm going to look at zoning and permitting to make sure that the use that I'm planning on using the building for moving forward is permitted, or do I need to get a special use permit, or is there a process there that I have to go through with the local municipality in order to get approval for that. So I'll want to definitely reach out to, if it's a city, a village, a county, a township, whoever it may be, just to find out, okay, here's the existing building, this is what it's currently being used for, here's my intended use. Is there any issues with this? Taxes. I'm going to take a look at the 5-year tax history on the property. In order to do that, you may need to reach out to your local assessor's office to find out, 1, what is the history on this property, and 2, to see, is there any type of like vacancy credits or anything that's being applied that may affect the taxes after I purchase it. Another good thing to check on is how much do they currently have the property assessed at for its values, and what's the equivalent market value that they're using versus what you're purchasing it at. For example, if the property has, a market value of $1 million and you're paying significantly above that, well, how does that impact your taxes once you close on the property, and vice versa? Another thing that should be going on really from day one and as soon as you are receiving it is the documentation review. And so this is where you're going through everything that the seller is providing to you. So that might be a rent roll, that might be operating expenses, utility bills, lease agreements, the list goes on and on. And so really you're going through double checking everything that was told to you from the time that the property was marketed or the first time that you saw it, and you're verifying, making sure that every T is crossed, I is dotted, and that everything that you were told about the property is lining up in the documentation. So a survey is most likely going to be required if you are doing any form of financing. There will probably be a plat survey or boundary survey that's required from your lender. It is a good practice to have that on file. So you'll want to be strategic on when you're ordering the survey, especially if you're the buyer and you are paying for that survey per the contract. Then that might be something where you want to make sure you check off a number of items on the list where you feel comfortable that you'll still move forward with the property before the survey gets ordered. And then make sure that you're budgeting enough time for that survey process. Could take a few weeks for that to get done. If you're looking for something that's more detailed than just a plat survey, more like an Alta survey, then you may have to add additional time to that as well. So make sure that you're talking to your surveyors and finding out what's the timeline and what's the cost. Another item that you may want to do is an environmental test. And so that may include what's called a phase 1, where you're looking at the history of the property to see what were the past uses for it. For example, if there was a gas station on the site, then that would raise some concerns that there may be pollutants in the grounds, which may lead you to do what's called a phase 2. On the phase 2, that's where a company is going to come out. They're going to do soil boring tests in the soil and test the soil samples to see, are there any pollutants in the grounds? And so if you're working with a lender, more than likely they are probably going to request at least a phase 1. If there is something that comes up on a past use that would raise some concerns, then a phase 2 is more than likely going to be required. Now, one thing I have seen is if your seller had ordered a phase 1 in the past and really the usage didn't change since the time they purchased it, you may be able to use a past phase 1 if that seller still has that available. So if you're using lending, or even if you're not using lending, an appraisal is another thing that you could use or that you may be required to get ordered. Make sure that you're budgeting enough time for the appraisal as well, as those may take a couple weeks to a few weeks depending on if there's any construction involved with that loan. Now, if you are working with a lender, more than likely they're the ones that are going to be ordering that appraisal, and they may go out and get bids from a few different appraisers and then look for, okay, who's the most affordable and who's the quickest turnaround time, depending on if you're in a time crunch. Now, if you are not using financing, you can still get an appraisal done on the property. Instances where you may run into that is if you're paying cash for it, or if there's some form of, let's say you're in a partnership on the property and one of the partners wants to be bought out, well, then you may go and order a third-party appraisal to see what the valuation is on that property. Everybody forgets about the insurance. Even me, and I'm a licensed insurance agent. And if you haven't done it already, now would be a great time to reach out to your insurance agent to get a quote on the insurance for the property. I highly recommend budgeting a couple weeks for them to turn around the quote, and the sooner you get started on that process, the better. Now, you can give them a future effective date to target that can correlate with what the tentative closing date is going to be. And if you need to change that once you get closer, it's a pretty simple process for the agent to do that. But I highly recommend you send them the information on the property. If there's tenants in the building, send them the rent roll with the information on the type of uses that are in the building, because they're going to need that to do their underwriting. And if you have any questions on that, make sure to drop us a comment below. At Pillar, aside from real estate, we are also an independent insurance brokerage, and we work with many different insurance companies in many different states. And so if you don't have a relationship there currently, make sure to reach out to us. Another thing I might do during due diligence is reach out to the utility companies. This is where I can, one, get everything switched over or ready to get switched over pending the closing date. The other thing, if I need additional meters on the property, that would be a good time to reach out, especially if I'm buying a property that had a vacancy. There may have been a meter that was taken off due to the vacancy. And one of the reasons why an owner may do that is because even though that space is vacant, they may have the meter removed because sometimes the utility utility companies will still charge a meter fee, which is kind of like a minimum fee that they put on there just because you have a meter on the building. And so that's one thing just to make sure, especially if you have plans on moving in as soon as you close on that property or have a tenant move in, then you want to be proactive and make sure that you're building in enough time for that utility company to get that scheduled. I've seen it where it's taken them a couple weeks to get a meter there on a building, and then you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs waiting. So making sure that you're proactive on that, as well as internet service. That's something too. If you have a certain internet provider that you intend on using, making sure that you're probably building in a couple weeks for them to come out and or get the service turned on is definitely recommended. So now you're through due diligence and you've got the clear to close from the lender if you're using one, and now is the time to get prepared for closing. So if you haven't already, this would be the time to establish the LLC or the entity that you'll be using to purchase the real estate. You'll also be opening up your checking account or banking accounts for that entity as well. And really, this is probably the time when you're going to start depositing funds, getting those in there, and getting everything ready for the closing date. In our state, we use attorneys for our closings. So usually the seller's attorney is coordinating with the title company and the buyer's attorney to get everything scheduled for closing. I realize in some other states, attorneys may not be used in the closing process. And so then the agents or the seller are coordinating with the title company to get that closing date scheduled. And now closing day. All right. So depending on the way that you structured it with your title company or with your attorney, now you may have pre-signed the closing documents. And so it's not uncommon for me to see sellers not show up to a closing just because they've already pre-signed everything and their attorney has the power of attorney to make any decisions for them up to a certain dollar amount. And I've also been to closings where the buyer wasn't present either, and just because they pre-signed everything before closing date. So really, closing day is where funds are getting transferred, keys are being delivered, checks are being cut, and everything is getting finalized. And if you made it this far, congratulations. I hope you enjoy your new purchase. And if you have any questions at all, please drop us a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll leave me a like. And if you are interested in seeing other material like this, please make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.